European Union has approved a law to regulate the use of artificial intelligence, which will look at banning some forms of AI, like police profiling data, to categorise people. Meanwhile, Hollywood star Scarlett Johansson has said she was left angered after the organisation, OpenAI, launched a chatbot with what she said was an eerily similar voice to her own. OpenAI has confirmed it would remove the voice, but insisted it wasn't meant to be an imitation of the actress. Let's speak now to Frederic Werner, who's the Chief of Strategy and Operations for AI for Good. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for your time today. So really interesting, this Scarlett Johansson story, and it certainly brings to everyone's attention lots of the debate around AI and whether organisations like OpenAI, how they can and where they can get material from.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I've been following it hour by hour, and I think both sides are emerging right now. And I think the crux of the story is, okay, my movie trivia knowledge is probably not up to par, but even if it was, I think the bigger question is, how would you know? And I think we're entering a world now where increasingly it's becoming more difficult to know what is true and what's not. And I would imagine you, as a member of the media and the press, can relate to that. So actually, we're hosting the United Nations AI for Good Global Summit in Geneva next week. And I would say the most pressing topic at the summit is going to be, how do you handle deepfakes, misinformation, and how do we work on standards to help to detect deepfakes, which would be very much needed when you start to look at all these different regulatory frameworks emerging around the world.
And I believe Sam Altman from OpenAI is going to be there, isn't he?
Absolutely. He's one of our top speakers. He'll be attending virtually. He's the only speaker attending virtually, apart from Geoffrey Hinton, who is also one of the top AI experts in the world. And I think rather than focusing on what we don't want at the summit, the goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the sustainable development goals and figure out how to scale those solutions for global impact. So we'll be bringing about 300 experts from around the world to look at AI for good solutions. But also importantly, what's new for this year's summit is we'll be adding a day dedicated to AI governance. So we're bringing together about 90 plus ministers and regulatory authorities from around the world, mixed with tech CEOs, with AI experts, with academics, with members of civil society, to basically try and go from principles to implementation. Because I think if you look at all these emerging regulatory frameworks around the world, the encouraging news is that they're emerging very quickly. And I think what we're trying to see is that they have more in common than they have different. And what we're going to try to do is, rather than come up with yet another set of texts, it's basically, let's look at these ambitious words and texts and how can we move from principles to implementation. And indeed, standards is one of the main tools for implementation. So
there is a tension there, though. Sorry to interrupt, Frederic. There is a tension there, isn't there, between the regulation that you talk about and whether it can keep pace with the tech companies and companies like OpenAI, and the view of those companies who think that perhaps everyone else is being a little too cautious about what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges, whether you're in the developed world or the developing world, is how do you keep up with the pace of innovation and technology and change? There is indeed a big gap between the ambitious regulations and policies and governance frameworks that are emerging, which are encouraging, and how do you actually implement these in a practical way that keeps up with speed? And that's very much going to be the focus of AI Governance Day next week. And if you're looking at all of the headaches that need to be solved, regardless of which part of the world you're in, I think everyone would agree that the epidemic of deepfakes and misinformation is the most pressing issue to be solved. So specifically, what we're going to be looking at is how do we develop standards for AI watermarking to detect basically if an image or a piece of media has been altered or if it's been AI generated. And I think if those standards would have been in place, maybe this whole discussion around Scarlett Johansson wouldn't have been an issue.
Okay, Frederic, good to talk to you. Frederic Werner there, Chief of Strategy and Operations at AI for Good.